In this video, we will show you how to replace your fuel injectors on this Ford Fusion with a 3.0 liter engine. This will be located under your intake along the top of your engine. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Since we are going to remove the upper intake, it's a good idea to remove as much debris that might be located along this upper area as possible. We'll use some compressed air for this. Once you've done that, let's make our way over to the fuse box. We're looking for the relay that we will have to remove. This would be this center one right here. Go ahead and take hold of that, give it a little wiggle, and lift it up and out of place. A quick inspection and you can set that aside. At this point, we're going to attempt to start up the vehicle. You may find that it starts and then stalls out, or it might just crank and not start at all. Either way, that's a good sign. We're trying to release fuel pressure from in the system. After you've tried to start the car a couple times and it did not want to start, continue back under the hood and reinstall that relay. After that, go ahead and close your fuse box. Make sure you have it in the proper placement so it's directly in the center of the relay area. Now let's make our way over to the negative battery terminal. We're going to remove this by using an 8mm. Go ahead and loosen that nut just enough that you can remove the terminal end from the battery. We'll just give each end a quick inspection here and we can set that aside so it's making no contact. Now we can start removing the air inlet tube. For this, we'll start at the mass airflow sensor. This connector is held in place with a red locking tab. Dislodge that, squeeze on the locking tab, and then pull this out of place. Give each end a quick inspection. Set the wiring harness aside. Let's separate the upper air filter housing from the lower air filter housing. You'll find that you have two locking clips to dislodge. Take hold of the upper housing. Separating it from the lower housing, we'll just carefully pull this away. Now that we have it pulled away, let's follow that towards the throttle body. As we make our way over here, we're going to disconnect this breather hose. It has a small tab that you can carefully take hold of, pull it down, and then you should be able to pull this hose off of the area. Just give that a quick inspection. Continue on to your 8mm headed clamp that holds the air intake to the throttle body. You could also use a flathead screwdriver if needed. While we're in this area, let's remove the air filter. We don't want any dirt making its way on the backside here. Just go ahead and give that an inspection and set it aside. Now we can start removing the throttle body. To do this, we're going to start up at the electrical connector. You know what to do. Take hold of that, pull that out of place. A quick squeeze, an inspection. Next, we'll move along to the four 10mm headed mounting bolts that hold the throttle body to the intake assembly. Keep in mind there is still two coolant tubes attached to the bottom of the throttle body. At this point, let's take hold of the throttle body, fully remove that mounting bolt, and then we'll rest this aside. With the throttle body out of the way, let's continue on to this area. You'll find that you have a tube that goes into a rubber hose which is held in place with a spring-loaded clamp. Squeeze on the ears, slide the clamp out of the way, and separate this area. We'll use some hose clamp pliers for this. If you find that you're having a hard time separating this, you may have to use a small pick to break it free. Just be careful not to damage that hose in any way. Make our way around. Just give each end a quick inspection. Make sure we don't lose that clamp. It's a good idea to reuse that. Continuing from the hose, we'll make our way just above it. You'll find that the EGR valve is held in place with two 10mm headed mounting bolts. We're going to remove both of the bolts. The valve itself will pretty much just stay in this area, but there is a gasket located between that we will have to remove. Now we can continue on to removing the gasket. It could potentially be stuck against the EGR valve or the EGR bracket. Let's continue making our way along the back side of the intake. We have a couple hoses and we also have an electrical connector. For each of the hoses, squeeze the clamp, slide it out of the way, and remove the hose from the intake. For the electrical connector, go ahead and squeeze in on that locking tab and just go ahead and press that out of the way. Quick inspection for corrosion. Set the wiring harness aside. We'll use a trim tool in this area. Separate it. Along the front of the intake, we have another wiring harness which is pressed into place. We'll be using the trim tool for this. Once everything's properly disconnected from the intake, we're going to continue on by removing several 8mm headed mounting bolts that hold it in place. Now this can be a little bit confusing, so you do want to pay attention. If you were to look along each corner, you're going to find that you have two bolts that are located right next to each other. We have to pay close attention because we only want to remove the bolts that hold the upper intake to the lower intake. We don't need to remove the lower intake mounting bolts. Remove your upper intake from the vehicle. Now that we have the intake out of the way, we have a clear view of our fuel rail, which is what houses each one of our fuel injectors. Before we go any further with the fuel injector area, we're going to make sure that we clean and inspect this area. Once we have it cleaned and inspected, we're going to make sure we cover each one of these ports so no dirt or debris makes its way inside the engine. This is very important. When you're pressing these into the engine, it's always a good idea to leave just a little bit hanging out. We don't want this falling all the way into the engine, and you do also want to have a clear reminder to remove them. Throughout the entire process continuing on, we're being extremely careful not to let anything fall inside of the engine that can cause catastrophic damage. Continue on to disconnecting each of your 6 fuel injectors. 3 of the fuel injector connectors are out in the open. The other 3 are located along the backside here. To disconnect your fuel injectors, go ahead and squeeze in on the locking tab and lift it up and out of place. Let's continue on separating the wiring harness from the fuel rail. Use a trim tool for this. You'll find that it's held in place in a few different areas. Now let's continue on to removing each of our 4 8mm headed bolts that hold the fuel rail down. At this point, it's time to start removing the fuel rail from the area. We'll have to pay attention to several things. Your 6 fuel injectors go down at an angle. 3 head towards the rear, and 3 head towards the front. To help ease this out of place, we're going to lubricate the O-rings at the bottom of the fuel injectors. We'll use a little bit of parts cleaner for this. We'll start prying this up a little bit. As we pry it up, we will have to come up and out at an angle because the fuel line does make its way over towards the driver's side. We're being careful not to break anything along the way. Here we are. Keep in mind there could still be a little bit of fuel inside of this area. Perfect. With the fuel rail and fuel injectors dislodged from the lower intake, you can continue on to removing the fuel injector from the fuel rail. The process for one will be the same for each. Looking along the top of each one of the fuel injectors, you're going to find a small metal lock. Go ahead and pull that out of place, and then you can remove the fuel injector from the fuel rail. You can see it along here. Keep in mind, as you remove this fuel injector, there could still be fuel inside of that fuel rail. Inspect each one of your locking clips as you remove it, replace it as necessary. And there it is, friend. Once you have the fuel injector out of place, it's important to make sure you look in the port of the fuel rail. We're confirming that there is no pieces of the original fuel injector in there or even part of the seal. Assuming that looks good, we can prepare for the installation of our brand new fuel injector. Make sure you take this and put it in the proper placement. Once you have it aligned, go ahead and twist it as you continue pressing it in. Continue on with your locking clip. Take this and slide it into place. When doing so, we're trying to bring it along the bottom side of the fuel rail into the slots that are on the fuel injector. Double check to make sure it's completely seated all the way around. You do not want the fuel injector coming loose on the fuel rail. Do the same exact thing to each and every fuel injector that you are replacing. If for some reason you're not replacing all of the fuel injectors, make sure that you clean and inspect the original fuel injectors, and then you can continue on to cleaning and inspecting the lower intake. Double check to make sure we still have the O-rings intact. Let's take that fuel rail and get it in place. While bringing it down, pay close attention to each one of your fuel injectors, being extremely careful not to cause any damage as we bring this down. We'll align each one of these fuel injectors with their corresponding area on the lower intake and slide it down into place. When doing so, you're going to have to rock this back and forth a little bit to try to align each one of those fuel injectors. Take your time, we don't want to cause any damage. Once you feel as though you have each one of those fuel injectors inside their corresponding holes, continue on to driving this down into place. Start in each of your 4 8mm headed mounting bolts that hold your fuel rail down, snug them up and torque them to 89 inch-pounds. Now that they're snug, we'll torque them to 89 inch-pounds. It's time to resecure our wiring harness. You remember that you had several push clips that hold this down in place. Align them, press them in. Fuel injectors. At this point, we're going to prepare several things so we can continue on to installing our upper intake. Start at the EGR valve. We want to make sure there's no existing gasket on this area and it's a clean, smooth surface. Let's continue on looking at the intake. We have the area where the EGR valve will sit against. We'll clean this. Double check to make sure you don't have any carbon inside this area. Let's move along to our throttle body port. Typically, it is a good idea to replace this gasket, but if you're not planning on it, you should at least go ahead and remove it either way and give it a close inspection. Make sure it's soft and pliable and it's not torn, worn, or damaged in any way. If you're planning on replacing it, you can just go ahead and pull it out of place, clean and inspect the intake where it should go, and then reinstall the new one. Let's just wipe this down. Double check to make sure there's no debris inside this area and continue on with installing the gasket. Align it with the corresponding hole and press it into place. Let's have a look along the bottom of the intake. You're going to find that you have 6 oval gaskets. You know exactly what to do. Carefully remove each one of the gaskets, give it a close inspection. Replace it, or just go ahead and clean it down, give it a close inspection. Clean and inspect the intake before you install the gasket. Align the gasket and slide it into place. Do the same to each port. Continue on to removing each one of the covers from in your ports, keeping in mind that there could potentially be debris in these areas. If you do have to wipe anything away, we'll make sure that we wipe it away from each one of the ports leading into the engine. Reconfirm that there's nothing inside of any of the ports leading into your engine. Once you've done so, continue on with your upper intake. Carefully rest the intake down in place. Start in each one of the mounting bolts before you fully tighten any of them. As we go to snug these down and torque them, we're going to do this in a very specific order. Starting in the center, we'll be making our way outward. Once they're all bottomed out, torque each of them to 89 inch-pounds in the same sequence. We'll go around one more time for good measure. Along the back side of the intake, we'll reconnect in our map sensor. Listen for a click, give that a nice tug. Continue on to your breather hose, squeeze on that clamp, put that in place, make sure it's nice and secure. Let's get this hose in place as well. We'll continue on at our EGR valve. Take the gasket, slide it in between the EGR valve and the bracket. Start in your two mounting bolts, snug them up. Torque each of those to 18 foot-pounds. Let's make our way over here. If we're reusing that spring clamp, we'll put that onto the line first, put this in position, hold it in place with that clamp. Double check to make sure that's completely secure. Now it's time to pay attention to the back side of the throttle body. We'll just give this a quick wipe and inspection. Once you've done so, you can continue on with installing it onto the intake. Take that and put it in place. Start in all four of your mounting bolts and snug them up. Once they're snug, torque them to 89 inch-pounds. Continue on to your electrical connector. Press it in, listen for a click, lock it in with the red locking tab. Continue on with your air filter. Now, before we start bringing this down, we're also going to take the air inlet tube and put it onto the throttle body. Now we can align those tabs, rock this into position, lock it down. Double check to make sure it's secure. Continue on to your mass airflow sensor. Make sure you lock it in. Make our way over here to the breather tube. Slide that in. Listen for a click. Give it a tug. Tighten your 8mm headed clamp. Double check to make sure this is nice and secure. Re-secure your wiring harnesses. Let's continue on to the negative battery terminal. Reconnect that, tighten it up with your 8mm wrench. Double check to make sure it's secure. Okay friends, we finished installing our fuel injector on our vehicle. At this point, you want to go ahead and attempt to start up the vehicle. You may find it takes a couple extra cranks to go ahead and start. That's because we have to build up fuel pressure in the system. Once it's started, you want to confirm that you do not have a fuel leak. Make your way under here and go ahead and give it a quick whiff. We want to make sure there's no fuel leak. Aside from that, no running condition and no exhaust leak. Take your vehicle for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.